This is an advanced topic in OHRP's educational video series. Before viewing this session, you should be knowledgeable about the basic principles of the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, regulations for the protection of human subjects of research. Welcome to the Office for Human Research Protection's educational video series. In this presentation, we will discuss the research use of human biological specimens and other private information. Today, we welcome Ms. Julie Kaneshiro, the team leader for policy in OHRP's Division of Policy and Assurances. Ms. Kaneshiro is here to help shed light on managing some of the challenges related to the research use of human biological specimens and other private information. Ms. Kaneshiro, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
One of the key challenges related to the use of these materials for research purposes is to understand when the regulations apply to a particular research activity. Could you clarify for us how, in general, one goes about determining whether the regulations apply to a particular activity?
Certainly. In general, there are three threshold questions that are important to consider in addressing whether the regulations would apply to a given activity. The first question to ask is whether the activity would involve research, as defined under our regulations. The second question is whether human subjects would be involved in that activity. And then if you've answered affirmatively to both of those questions, that the activity would indeed involve both research and involve human subjects, the third question to consider is whether the human subjects research activity would be exempt under our regulations. In regards to the first question, which is whether the activity involves research, sometimes studies that involve the collection or banking of specimens or other data for future unspecified research purposes will raise the question of whether such activities will constitute research under our regulatory definition. And it is OHRP's view that such activities will often meet our regulatory definition of research, since they will constitute systematic investigations that are designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. In regards to the second question that I mentioned, which is whether human subjects will actually be involved in an activity, there are essentially two ways in which an individual becomes a human subject under our regulations. The first way is if an investigator is either intervening or interacting with a living individual for a research purpose to obtain either data or specimens. The second way is if the investigator is obtaining individually identifiable private information or specimens about an individual. Keep in mind that under our definition of human subject, individually identifiable information means that the identity of the individual to whom the specimen or the data pertain can be readily ascertained or readily associated with the information by the investigator. Another key point to keep in mind about our definition of human subject is that it only pertains to living individuals. So if an investigator is obtaining data or specimens about deceased individuals, then our regulations would not apply. So then thirdly, the third question I mentioned is in regards to whether, if the activity is determined to both involve research and human subjects, the question to ask is whether the research activity would qualify for one of the exemptions under our regulations. And the exemption that's most often applicable to research involving human biological specimens or data would be Exemption 4. And we can talk more about that exemption later if you wish.
Now, the definition of human subject references the investigator obtaining data or private information. It does not mention the use of human biological specimens. So why do the regulations apply to the research use of human biological specimens?
Well, OHRP interprets human biological specimens to be private information. So if an investigator obtains a specimen from a living individual through a research intervention or interaction, then the research would involve human subjects under our regulations. In addition, if an investigator obtains individually identifiable specimens about living individuals, then the research will also involve human subjects.
Your answer seems to be suggesting that there may be instances when an investigator could use specimens or other private information for research purposes without involving human subjects. Could you elaborate?
Yes, you're correct. Essentially, if two things are both true, then the research would not involve human subjects. The first is if the research does not involve an investigator either intervening or interacting with a living individual in order to obtain data or a specimen. The second thing that would need to be true in order for the research not to involve human subjects would be if the investigator does not obtain individually identifiable information, private information, or specimen about living individuals. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, let me give you an example. An example of a research study that would not involve human subjects would be a study that involves the investigator obtaining data that was solely collected for clinical purposes. Right. And before the investigator obtains this information, all the identifiers would be removed from the clinical data before being provided to the investigator. In this circumstance, human subjects would not be involved because there would not have been a research intervention or interaction to obtain the data, since it was collected solely for clinical purposes. And secondly, human subjects would not be involved because the investigator is obtaining simply anonymous information that would not allow the investigator to identify the individuals from whom the data pertain. So that would be an example of a research study that would not involve human subjects research.
What if the specimens or data are coded? Are they then individually identifiable?
Yes, generally, coded information is considered to be individually identifiable, but there are exceptions to this. For example, remember that our regulatory definition of human subject talks about individually identifiable information as being information by which the identity of the individual to whom the information pertains can be either readily ascertained or associated with the information by the investigator. So if there are mechanisms that are put into place that would prevent a recipient investigator from being able to readily ascertain the identity of the individuals to whom the specimens pertain, even if the information is coded, the investigator would not be considered to have individually identifiable information, and human subjects would not be involved in that type of a research activity.
So if specimens or other private information is coded, wouldn't it be possible to identify the individuals to whom the specimens or other private information pertain?
Yes, in fact, generally a code is retained with the information in order to allow someone to be able to re-identify the individuals from whom the specimens or the information pertain. However, the key under our definition of human subjects is whether the investigator will be able to do so. And in fact, in August of 2004, OHRP issued a guidance document that talks about some of the complexities of this kind of assessment in more detail.
Could you give examples of ways an investigator could use coded materials so that the identity of the individuals to whom the materials pertain cannot be readily ascertained?
Certainly. OHRP's guidance document on coded private information and specimens gives several examples of this kind, but one example that is provided and is used by many institutions is to establish an agreement between the provider of the coded specimens and the recipient investigator, whereby there is an agreement that the recipient investigator will not obtain the key to the code that would enable individuals to be re-identified under any circumstances, at least until the individuals to whom the coded private information or specimens pertain are deceased.
So you're saying that if there is a firewall that prevents the investigator from obtaining or accessing individually identifiable information, then human subjects would not be involved in the research and the regulations would not apply?
Yes, that's correct, provided that there was no research intervention or interaction with the living individual in order to obtain the specimens or the data.
And what about the person providing the investigator with the coded private information? Would that person also be considered an investigator?
Well, it depends. It depends on the role of that person providing the coded specimens or data. If the person's role is limited to simply providing the coded specimens or providing the coded data to investigators, then OHRP would not consider such a person to be an investigator in the research project. So, for example, if you consider a research repository that involves the collection, or that actually maintains a collection of specimens for research purposes. And the only role of such a repository in a research study is to provide coded specimens to recipient investigators, but will not have any other role in the conduct of the research. Then such repository staff who are providing the specimens and retaining the key would not be considered investigators in the research activity. In contrast, consider a research repository of this kind. However, in a particular research study, let's say that the repository staff are not only providing the coded specimens to recipient investigators and retaining a key, but will also be involved in analyzing any resultant data that's derived from the specimens. In that circumstance, OHRP would consider the repository staff to be investigators in the research project. And so even if there were a so-called firewall established between the repository staff and the recipient investigator, in that case, OHRP would still consider the research to involve human subjects, in that at least one or more of the members of the research team here would be able to readily ascertain the identity of the individuals to whom the coded specimens or coded data pertain. And it's OHRP's view that if any of the investigators are able to identify the individuals, then the research will involve human subjects.
So, if a research study involving coded specimens or other private information is determined to involve human subjects, does that mean that all institutions involved in the activity are engaged in human subjects research?
Well, no, not necessarily. You have to look at the specific activities being conducted by all of the institutions involved in a given research activity. Keep in mind that only those institutions that are determined to be engaged in human subjects research are required to have an assurance with our office, a federal-wide assurance or an FWA with our office, and that an IRB designated under that FWA would be required to review and approve any human subjects research to be conducted at that given institution. So let me give you an example of a human subjects research study that would not mean that all participating institutions would necessarily be engaged in that human subjects research project. Consider a study that involves the obtaining of a specimen through intervention or interaction with a living individual. And so in this case, the research will involve human subjects because it involves the obtaining of a specimen specifically for this research project. This is an example of a research study that would not actually meet any of the exemptions under our regulations. Okay? But further consider that there will be another institution that will be involved only in the analysis of coded specimens. Right? And let's say further that that recipient institution that will be conducting the analysis of the coded specimens will only see coded specimens, and that there's an agreement in place that would prohibit, in fact, those recipient investigators at that other institution from ever having access to the key to the code that would allow for them to re-identify the individuals to whom the specimens pertain. Okay. In this case, this is an example of a research study that does involve human subjects research that's not exempt. However, the recipient investigators at the other institution that are only receiving coded specimens and will therefore be analyzing just coded specimens would not be considered engaged in human subjects research.
Can you elaborate on this point? The considerations for determining whether a research study involves human subjects seem similar to the considerations for determining whether an institution is engaged in human subjects research. Is this correct?
Yes, you're correct. The considerations are similar, but they're not identical. And your question actually highlights the importance of those three threshold questions that I mentioned earlier, and the importance of the order in which these questions are asked. So you'll recall that the first question to be considered is whether the activity involves research. Secondly, whether the activity involves human subjects, and if so, then the next question to ask is whether the human subjects research activity qualifies for any of the exemptions under our regulations. The fourth question to be asked would be whether the institutions that are involved in the conduct of the research would be considered engaged in the conduct of the human subjects research study. And actually taking any of these questions out of order can lead to incorrect conclusions.
Now, what we've discussed so far is focused on determining whether a research activity involves human subjects. Many investigators, though, are confused about when the use of existing specimens and other private information does not involve human subjects versus when their use is exempt. Can you explain this point?
Yes, certainly. This can be a difficult assessment. And it actually, again, highlights the importance of those three threshold questions: whether the activity involves research, whether human subjects are involved, and only if you've answered affirmatively that the activity does indeed involve both research and human subjects do you ask the question of exemption. The exemption that I mentioned earlier that's most often applicable to research involving human biological specimens or data is Exemption 4. And under Exemption 4, the exemption pertains to research that involves existing data, documents, or specimens, provided that at least one of two conditions is met. First, that the information or the specimens be publicly available, or if not publicly available, that the information be recorded by the investigator in such a manner that subjects could not be identified either directly or indirectly through links that are retained with the data. So there are really three factors that are important to focus on in determining whether Exemption 4 is applicable to a human subjects research study. The first being whether the data are existing at the time in which the research is proposed for exemption. The second consideration is whether the information or the specimens are publicly available. Keep in mind that in most cases, human biological materials would not be considered publicly available, meaning essentially available without restriction. Generally, there are restrictions imposed upon the obtaining of human biological specimens. The third consideration to focus on is how the information is recorded by investigators. So if the information is recorded in such a manner that investigators are not able to identify subjects either directly or indirectly, then Exemption 4 will apply. And keep in mind, too, that if the information is recorded by investigators in a coded fashion, then Exemption 4 would not apply in this case.
Can you explain this further? Maybe give two examples, one of a research study that uses coded information but does not involve human subjects, and another of a research study that does involve human subjects but meets the requirements of Exemption 4.
Yes. Let me first give you an example of a research study that involves this coded private information or specimens but does not involve human subjects. Let's take, for example, a research study where an investigator is interested in looking at the efficacy of two forms of chemotherapy treatment for a particular type of cancer. And as part of this research study, the investigator is obtaining data that was collected for clinical purposes and will only be receiving coded data. And let's say further that there is an agreement established between the provider of the coded specimens, the clinicians in this case, for the patients, and the recipient investigator, such that the recipient investigator will never have access to the key to the code that would enable the investigator to re-identify the individuals. This would be an example of a research study that does not involve human subjects because there would not have been a research intervention or interaction to obtain the data, given that the data being used in the research study were collected solely for clinical purposes. In addition, because the investigator is not able to readily ascertain the identity of the individuals to whom the data pertain, then the information also would not be individually identifiable to the recipient investigator, and therefore human subjects would not be involved in that research activity. In contrast, then, let me give you now an example of a human subjects research study that may qualify for Exemption 4. Take a similar type of research study. The investigator is looking at trying to determine the efficacy of two different types of chemotherapy treatment. However, in this study, let's say the investigator is going to the clinic, where the patients were being treated, and looking at fully identifiable medical records of these patients. In this case, the investigator is just recording certain information, however, from those medical records. Let's say they were recording the diagnosis of the patients, they were recording the treatment received, they were recording clinical outcomes associated with the treatments. And let's say they're also recording some limited demographic information, such as the age or the sex of the patients. In this case, the research would involve human subjects because the investigators are obtaining individually identifiable private information because they are seeing the fully identifiable medical records of the patients. However, since the investigators are recording the information in such a way that they're not able to identify the individuals, subjects, either directly or through identifiers linked to the subjects, then this would be an example of a human subjects research study that would qualify for Exemption 4.
From what you've said, it seems that the determination of whether human subjects are involved in a particular activity or whether the activity is exempt can be rather tricky. How would you advise institutions to approach these determinations?
Well, you're absolutely right, Rick. These determinations can be quite difficult and complex. OHRP recommends that institutions have in place policies and procedures that identify who at the institution will be responsible for making decisions about whether an activity or research study that involves coded private information constitutes human subjects research under our regulations or not. In addition, we recommend that this person or entity who's charged with making these decisions be knowledgeable about the human subject protection regulations, and we recommend further that investigators not be given the independent authority to make these decisions. Similarly, in regards to exemptions, we recommend that these decisions be made by someone other than the investigator and that they be made by someone who is knowledgeable about the human subject protection regulations.
All right. Thanks again, Julie.
My pleasure.
And thanks to you for joining us in our discussion with Julie Kaneshiro. We hope you found this session informative. For further guidance on today's topic, see Guidance on Research Involving Coded Private Information or Biological Specimens. This document is posted on OHRP's site. This video guidance represents OHRP's current thinking on this topic at the time of production and should be viewed as recommendations unless specific regulatory requirements are cited. The use of the word must in OHRP guidance means that something is required under HHS regulations at 45 CFR Part 46. The use of the word should in OHRP guidance means that something is recommended or suggested but not required. An institution may use an alternative approach if the approach satisfies the requirements of the HHS regulations at 45 CFR Part 46.